morning, 4 Mile. So thank you for worshiping with us this morning, whether you're in-house or online. We're glad you're here. My name is Brian Grubbs, and I'm an elder here at the church. So this is a little bit different for me because I'm a teacher. So I'm used to standing in front of people and talking, but usually I pace around my classroom during my lesson, checking for cell phones. And so I had a couple of people offer to put their hoods up and stare at their phones while I was presenting the message, but I told them I didn't think it was necessary. So for the past several months, we've been studying the Old Testament prophets. Elijah, whose name means, "My God is Yahweh," and Elisha, whose name means, "My God is salvation." We've seen how God used these two prophets to demonstrate his grace to the Israelites and to teach the truth that God saves his people and provides for their needs. Throughout Advent, we'll focus on the book of John, diving into the miracles of Jesus and reflecting on how the works of Elijah and Elisha pointed to the ultimate fulfillment of prophecy, that God would send a Messiah to bring salvation to Israel. We began looking at the miracles of Jesus several weeks ago. Cammie looked at the wedding at Cana when Jesus turned water into wine. Josh talked about the healing of the official son. And Jack led us through the healing at the pool. With each miracle, we saw Jesus extend his grace to those in need. Remember, grace is God's unmerited favor, which we don't deserve. We can't earn it. We can't buy it. We can only receive it. And he gives it freely. Today, we'll be looking at John 6, 1 through 15, the feeding of the 5,000. Now, some people think the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000 are two accounts of the same event, but they're not. Mark discusses both in his gospel as separate events with different details. 5 loaves and 2 fish in John's account versus 7 loaves and a few fish in the feeding of the 4,000. Of all the miracles that Jesus performed in the scriptures, only the resurrection and the feeding of the 5,000 are recorded in all 4 gospels. We'll focus on John's account, but you might find it helpful to look at the other gospel accounts later. So the teacher in me's already assigned homework, and I haven't even gotten to the lesson. So let's dive in. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs he was doing on the sick. So, first question, after what? Well, looking back to John 5, we see that the feeding of the 5,000 follows the miracle of the healing at the pool and the interactions that Jesus had with the Jews as a result of that. At some point after their time in Jerusalem, Jesus and his disciples returned to the region of Galilee. It's possible that as many as 6 months had passed since the healing at the pool. But eventually, according to John, they crossed the Sea of Galilee, which is about 7 or 8 miles wide, to the far eastern shore near Bethsaida. This was the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip, and it's not the same as Bethesda where the healing at the pool occurred. The account in Luke 9 notes that Jesus withdrew to Bethsaida, suggesting he was attempting to get away from the crowds. At this point in his ministry, he'd begun to draw a significant amount of attention through his healing of the sick. Some people were following him because of his teaching. Some had physical needs of their own, and honestly, some were likely following just hoping to see Jesus perform a miracle. The continual demand would have taken a physical and spiritual toll on him, so time away from the people would help him recharge. Jesus is demonstrating that sometimes it's necessary for us to step back and recharge, physically, mentally, and spiritually, so that we're better prepared to go and make disciples. Jesus went up the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Now there's no consensus on what mountain, since they were near Bethsaida. They were in the region of what's now known as the Golan Heights. And it was near the time of the Passover. John's account is the only one that tells us it was near Passover. Remember, Passover is the feast when the Jews celebrate their deliverance from Egypt. In Moses' time, the Jews placed lamb's blood on their doorposts, and the Lord passed over their homes during the plague in which all of the firstborn of Egypt died. The Israelites were saved from the plague, and Moses led them out of Egypt, across the Red Sea. God delivered the Israelites from the hands of the Pharaoh and into the wilderness, where for 40 years he sustained them until they were able to enter the promised land. He provided daily manna, but they could only gather what was necessary for that day. The people that were following Jesus would have been well aware of the nearness of Passover and mindful that God not only delivered them from Pharaoh, but had also promised a Messiah who they believed would deliver them from the hands of the Romans. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Even though Jesus is trying to withdraw from the crowds, they keep following him, and he doesn't send them away. In fact, though John doesn't mention it, based on the other gospel accounts, Jesus had probably spent that day teaching the crowd. And he recognized that they would need food. These people just showed up, many just to see if he'd do something amazing, and Jesus saw their need for food. Talk about grace. No one there deserved to be fed by Jesus. He could have easily told them, "Hey, the show's over, and it's time for you guys to go home, find dinner, find a place to sleep." In fact, the Gospel of Luke says this is exactly what his disciples suggested that Jesus do. But instead, Jesus looked at Philip, and he asked him where they could buy bread for the crowd. Now remember, Philip was a local. He was from Bethsaida, so he would have known where the nearest bakery was. He could have said, go down there past where Enoch's donkey barn used to be, turn left, go down the road, and there's a guy there that makes the best pitas. But Jesus said this to test Philip. The Message paraphrase says to stretch his faith, and for that matter, the faith of all of his disciples, because Jesus already knew what he was going to do. So how did Philip answer? Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. 200 denarii was worth about 8 months' wages for a working-class Israelite. And even that would have only been enough to give everyone a little, a taste. So 8 months' wages wouldn't provide a satisfying meal for those who were in the crowd. Now, it's tempting for us to look at Philip's answer and say, where's his faith? He'd been following Jesus for a while. He'd seen Jesus perform many miracles. But Jesus had asked him where they could buy bread, and he gave an honest assessment of the situation. This was a teaching moment. The question Jesus asked highlighted the impossibility of the task in the eyes of man. Just like Philip, we often look at our situations from our own human perspective, basing our answers on what we can do on our own. But with Christ, anything is possible. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?" Andrew was also from Bethsaida. Like it says, he was the brother of Peter, and he was a disciple of John the Baptist before he left to follow Jesus. And Andrew has a solution. There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And then in the same breath, he realizes the insignificance of that contribution. What are they for so many? Think about it. 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 fish carried by a boy. How much is there? The fish were likely tilapia, which is a common species in the Sea of Galilee, similar to what you'd buy at the grocery store, and the loaves couldn't have been much larger than Kaiser rolls. So what Andrew realizes is they have a couple of fish sandwiches and 3 extra rolls. That isn't really enough for a few people, let alone a crowd. Isn't this like 2 Kings 4? When a man brought his first fruits to Elisha, 20 barley loaves and some grain. The servants said it was insufficient for 100 men, and in the eyes of man it was. The offering was simply not enough to feed them all. But Elisha told the servant, "For this is what the Lord says, they will eat and have some left over." How often do we feel this way? My tithe, my time, my talent, it's so little. What use can this be to God? How often do we look at what we bring before God and think, "God, you should probably look elsewhere because I doubt you can do much with this"? And how often, when we're obedient and heed God's call, are we amazed at how much he does with what appears to us to be so little? And despite the doubt, Jesus doesn't flinch. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. Have the people sit down. John says Jesus knew what he would do. He was going to throw a picnic. So he has them sit in the grass. And this details a subtle reminder that it was springtime, near the time of the Passover. And the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. So where were the women and children? They were there, they just aren't mentioned. Some scholars have attempted to extrapolate how many people were there in total when counting the women and the children, and some have estimated upwards of 15,000. But the fact is, it doesn't matter. It was a huge crowd of people, and 5 loaves and 2 fish were completely insufficient to feed them. It doesn't matter if it was 5,000 or 25,000. And what does Jesus do to begin the meal? He gives thanks, demonstrating that he was reliant on God for this daily bread, a recognition that God had provided this meal for them all. This should be our attitude as well. God provides for his children, and we should always be thankful for his provision. And once he gave thanks, he distributed the bread to the crowd, and likewise the fish, with the help of the disciples. That's noted in the other Gospels. Jesus served the crowd. Not only did he see their need for food and act out of grace, but he chose to serve the meal. He could have just made the meal appear before each of them out of nowhere, but he chose to distribute the food with the help of the disciples. Now, this required the disciples to trust Jesus would refill their baskets every time they returned for more to distribute. They had to trust for their daily bread, just like the Israelites in the desert. Just like we need to trust him because he'll provide for our needs. Not always in the way we envision, but always according to what we truly need. And it says everyone received as much as they wanted. There were no limitations, no take one piece and we'll see if there's enough for seconds. Christ provided for the crowd through his grace. Remember, he didn't have any obligation to feed them. They weren't really invited. And he provided in abundance. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. Everyone finished their meal. Thousands of people had eaten until they were full from 5 loaves and 2 fish. And there were leftovers. Now, when God provided manna in the desert for the Israelites after the Passover, they were only to take what was needed for the day. Any extras would spoil by the next morning. But Jesus wanted nothing to be lost. So he had his disciples gather the leftovers, 12 baskets full. Are the 12 baskets significant? Maybe they represented the 12 tribes of Israel and that Jesus supplies for the needs of the entire nation. Maybe Jesus was making a point to his disciples, 1 basket for each one, so that each of them had evidence of his grace to both them and the crowd. and maybe Jesus and his disciples just had 12 baskets. But no matter which, Jesus demonstrated to his disciples and the crowd that he'll provide for their needs abundantly, beyond their expectations, if they have faith and respond to him in obedience, just like the boy with the loaves and the fish. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." There was no denying the miracle. The people saw what had happened, and they recognized that this was from God and that Jesus was the prophet who was promised by Moses when he led the Israelites out of Egypt. Manna was provided for them in the desert then, and Jesus now provided the bread they needed to sustain themselves now. It was a statement. If Jesus could feed 5,000 with 2 fish and 5 loaves, surely he could lead them against the Romans. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. The people recognized they had been promised a Messiah who would deliver them from their oppressors. They could make him king and force him to deliver them from the Romans. But Jesus withdrew to the mountain. He escaped. We see this a few times in Scripture, where in the fervor of the moment, the crowd attempts to force the narrative. Here, in this passage, they're ready to make him king. In the Gospel of Luke, there's a moment after Jesus spoke in the synagogue that the people were prepared to throw him off a cliff. And in both instances, Jesus slips away. He disappears. Why? Because Jesus knew it wasn't his time. He wanted no part of their political revolution. Satan had already tempted him with all the kingdoms of the world at the beginning of his ministry. All he had to do was bow, and he refused, because he knew his Father had a greater end in mind. Jesus was and is looking for obedient hearts who'll put their faith into action, who'll bring what they see as insufficient and allow him to multiply it for his kingdom. God provides abundantly. Sometimes it just ends up looking a little different than what we expect. And not only does he provide, but he uses it for his glory alone. Later on, at the end of John's gospel, it's written, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." John recorded these miracles so that we, 2,000 years later, might believe that Jesus is the Messiah and have life abundantly in his name. Not only us, but when we act out of obedience, with our belief and our behavior lining up with his straight edge of truth, bringing what little we can contribute, just like the boy with his barley loaves and fish, he can make so much more of it and use us to fulfill his commission to go and make disciples. Let's go.